Hey, it's me, Chance Johnson with the 148th Wing Public Affairs, and you're listening to the 148th Wing Podcast. Today I have with me Chaplain Joseph Friedman, a.k.a. Lieutenant Colonel Friedman, a.k.a. Rabbi Friedman. Thanks for joining us, sir. How are you today?
Indescribably wonderful.
Good.
A.k.a. Papa Smurf.
That's your call sign, right?
Yeah.
All right. How did you come up with that? Well, you didn't come up with it.
I
was
did
given
not
to
come
you.
up with it.
Right.
When I was in commissioned officer training, so we had all these flights, and our flight was Papa Flight. And somehow or another, I ended up becoming tasked with writing all the jodies and chants that we did while we were marching. And I came up with this incredible one about Papa Smurf going off the cot. And next thing you know,
Off the
I was
cot?
commissioned officer training.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And next thing I know, I was Papa Smurf.
All right. Well,
The fact that I was about 28 years older than the next oldest guy in my flight didn't
yeah.
hurt.
So, and I didn't want to assume that, but I did assume that, but I didn't want to mention that was it because you were the oldest. You have a lot of you have a pretty extensive background in your career, a lawyer, rabbi, and then also being a commissioned officer.
Musician, salesman.
Okay.
We can go on.
Yeah. How do you juggle all these careers?
Poorly. They situations present themselves. You make decisions, cost benefit analysis. What's the right move at that moment for your family,
Okay.
for yourself, and you make those moves. I remember being advised by my stepfather that there does come a point of diminishing returns. You can't keep changing jobs, but circumstances.
Okay. Well, so this is your full-time career right now.
Correct.
Are you still involved in doing law?
No, not formally. I do it informally in the sense that I'm the only chaplain I think in the Air Force who's a lawyer. So I've been asked by the Bureau to do things like research issues of chaplain confidentiality under Title 32, which is not addressed by the AFI. And as a result of that, I was actually asked to rewrite the new DAFI
Oh, wow.
that came out regarding for chaplains on Chapter 5, which is on confidentiality.
Okay.
Issues of using National Guard training money to send a chaplain OCONUS without the base commander requesting a chaplain under an AMC regime.
Okay.
What would be the legality of that? All kinds of issues where there's some tangency. In the most recent past, we had all the issues of religious accommodation requests for COVID shots. And I was very involved with the Bureau in writing up templates and writing up process and procedures because of that background. So they call on me to do that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
Other than that, I give a lot of free advice.
Yeah. Yeah, you do. You give me a lot of free advice. I appreciate that. And
Always with the caveat that I am not licensed in the state of Colorado to practice law.
Okay. Where are you licensed to do it?
I was licensed in Tennessee.
Okay, because that's where you were originally
Correct.
Commissioned, right? And that's something that I bring up pretty much every time I do this. Is that's just an example of how cool the Guard is, and that everybody kind of seems to have like a second life or another background besides what their job is in the military or with the Guard, and so those resources can be utilized, outside of what you're tasked to do officially here. So that's something I definitely appreciate about being here.
Well said.
Yeah. Like even with me, I'm not officially a public affairs person. I'm a vehicle maintenance technician, but I have a background in media, and so I can get utilized here.
And you got that great voice.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. You were commissioned in 2010, is that right?
09.
Okay. What inspired you at that point in your life that you wanted to do that?
Oh, it was totally mercenary. I had the worst possible intentions. I decided, my wife and I decided after a business I had gone into ended up disastrously failing with the CEO and the COO ending up in jail for the next 20 years, along with all of my money, as well as the $17 million I had raised from other people in these real estate investment deals we were in. It was a pretty bad moment. And decided I want to go to law school at the tender age of 46. But was petrified of getting out of law school 3 years later with all that debt. And I'm happy you mentioned that in synagogue. And this guy who was in the process of retiring from the Air Force turns to me and said, well, the local Guard unit's looking for a chaplain. I said, well, what does that help me? And he explained how the Guard has tuition assistance programs, and I'd be paid a salary while I'm in school. And it's 4 years. and I found out later, 80% of direct commissions, 80% do foreign out. I don't know if that's still the case, but that certainly was the case then. And I had this idea, great, I'll do 3 years of law school, cross my fingers for the 4th year that they don't deploy me, and then I'll be finished. And I will have hopefully made an impact on that debt. Well, it turns out that the woman who was in charge of the student loan side of things, the state fund side of things at my wing in Memphis, was horribly inept. And I ended up with a half a semester's worth of assistance, and that's all I got for 3 years, besides what I got in terms of a bonus. So I ended up getting almost no tuition assistance, but I drank the Kool-Aid. It was blue, and I drank it copiously. And when I graduated law school, found out the world did not need another 50-year-old Jewish lawyer, and my commander at the time offered me a full-time position there on a temporary basis, which soon became a permanent job.
Okay. All right. So have you ever actually practiced like with a law firm?
So I started my own firm.
Okay.
I was doing immigration law for a very short period of time, concurrent with, it was like part-time concurrent with my full-time chaplaincy. And it was untenable. I wasn't prepared to go in full-time because I couldn't take the financial risk. Nobody was hiring a 50-year-old. This was at the very end of the recession. It was 2012, but it still was pretty well entrenched, especially in Memphis. And there was no way I was going to do it myself. I wasn't being hired. I had a few clients. I specialized in military immigration, which is a lot of people who are not citizens try to join the military to get their citizenship. I was helping those people, but it wasn't working for me. I was getting nothing out of it, emotionally, personally, and for that matter, financially.
Yeah.
So I walked away.
Yeah, well, and that's I guess I assumed that was something that you did as a much younger man is get that education. So that's really interesting that you decided to get that later on in life. So as a rabbi, do you still lead a congregation?
No, that's what brought me to Denver. I had left when I was in Memphis going to law school, joining the Guard. I did not have a congregation at that time. I had left that career behind me, swearing I'd never do it again. There was a position opened in Denver that I chanced upon by accident. You see what I did there? Chanced upon by accident because I had come up to Buckley in 2015 for a strong bonds training over at the LDC here on base. Couldn't get home in time for my Sabbath back to Memphis. And my wife said, well, we got friends who live in Denver. Go spend the weekend with them. And I walk in my uniform, and she goes to me, well, you're here. Why don't you apply as the rabbi of our synagogue? We're looking for a rabbi. I said, I thought you liked me. Like, why would you even suggest that? But I felt the calling. I felt this was an opportunity. I felt this is what God wanted me to do. And that's what brought us to Denver. So I went back to being a DSG at this unit while I had a congregation in town. And for the next 5 years, I was reminded every day why I left my previous pulpit. And thank God in 2020, at the time, our wing commander, Colonel Fessler, entertained for the first time in the history of this wing the idea of having a full-time chaplain. And I jumped.
That's great. That's great. Well, I'm glad you're here. So,
well, thank you.
And I don't know if this is something that people, I have had, I don't want to say difficulty, but maybe I don't know how to distinguish sometimes of what your responsibilities are alongside of the director of psychological health. So what is your role as a chaplain at the unit, and how do you differ from that role?
That's a great question. Chaplains really have 3 primary swim lanes. One could argue first and foremost religion, but the truth of the matter is, the irony is in the Guard, we almost do none of that. Very few, think of DSGs, for example. They're not coming here 2 days out of the month to find God. They have their home church. If they're involved in any kind of religious organization or community, they're not coming here for that. And every time we've tried to start services, that doesn't usually work. It drills 16 hours that are usually jam-packed. Yeah. Exactly. And it's just, there's no time. We go out, we'll do devotionals within units, but it's not quite the same. Things do come up, and even especially with the full-timers. I had not long ago a situation where a female came to me. She needed an Ash Wednesday service. Well, newsflash, as an Orthodox rabbi, I'm not providing her with an Ash Wednesday service. But
that's a Catholic thing, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
But it's my responsibility. Our line is we either provide or provide for the religious needs of every airman. Mm-hmm. So it's my responsibility to provide for her need. So my job was to find where I could get her a service here, which I found that when the 460th was doing their service, and then called her commander, who was not allowing her to go, to let him know why it was important that he needs to let her do that. So that's an example of providing for religious needs.
Okay.
With the COVID-19 exemptions, that would be another example of people coming for a religious exemption. They're coming to the chaplain. I've had in the last month 2 requests for people who are looking into their Nordic pagan past and looking for waivers to have beards. Again, an example where our religious accommodations and that swim lane is being implemented. But as you can imagine, it's not that much. Interestingly, a couple of years ago during COVID began, right around Christmas time, I was getting a lot of calls of people who were actually in religious crisis, just trying to understand God, and they just needed some help with that. But
Probably a lot of time to think about that too.
Well,
being
because
in
of
lockdown,
COVID?
and yeah,
Absolutely. I think so.
Yeah.
And that was the first time since really 2009 when I joined that I've ever had those kind of questions in any kind of intense, meaningful manner. So that's swim lane number 1. Swim lane number 2 is advising leadership. Because we're all over the base, because we're talking to people all over the place, which brings us to point 3, which has confidentiality. We'll get to that in a second. We tend to have a good picture of what's going on around the entire wing, where squadrons are having issues, shops are having problems. And that gives us a unique window that allows us to go into commanders and say, listen, I don't know what you're hearing from your squadron commander or your flight SEL, but I'm telling you, this is what we're hearing in this place, this place, this place. Or you may have somebody who I know is about to get disciplined for something, but I know because of counseling I've done with that person that they're really in a very tenuous mental state.
Okay.
And that type of
that's
discipline,
a variable,
right, needs to be taken into consideration that the commander doesn't know. So I can go and not reveal any confidence, but maybe suggest a different approach because of things that I can't tell them, but they'll trust me.
Okay. All right.
So that would be a second swim lane. The third is this issue of counseling. The DoD in their infinite wisdom decided that there needs to, and this is for the entire military, there needs to be one place that service members can go to let off steam with absolute impunity, that there is absolute confidentiality. We have more confidentiality than a Catholic priest. A Catholic priest, excuse me, will never reveal what was said in the confessional, but they can be hauled into court and held in contempt. Now they'll go to jail. They will never tell. They'll go to jail, but they can be held. We can't even be brought to court. Now, regarding Title 32, there's a question about one area, and that has to do with child abuse / elder abuse that's being debated right now regarding that level of confidentiality in states in which clergy are mandatory reporters of child / elder abuse. Okay. But for Title 10, not even a question. Even in those states, they have it's total confidentiality. So when I joined, I remember asking the chaplain in Memphis I was going to be working with, I said, you telling me that people save up their junk for 28 days to bring to the chaplain on drill weekend? He said, you'd be surprised. There's stuff they don't want their pastor to know back in, Hushpuckany, Tennessee.
Right.
There's stuff they don't want their spouse, family members, whoever, maybe even their therapist to know. But they can trust you because they don't see you except once a month.
Yep.
But I found that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was because all those members and I share one thing in common, and that's the uniform that we wear. And as you well know, there comes a point where you begin to see everything in your life, even when you're a DSG, through the lens of your uniform. It could be particularly after you've been deployed, but you begin to think as a military member and not just as a civilian. And sometimes civilians don't understand that perspective, and you need to speak to somebody who wears the uniform.
Sure. Yeah.
So that gives us that sort of cachet with members. How that distinguishes from the DPH, so we have a phenomenal DPH here, Virginia Howard, with our wing. So number one, there is the issue of reporting confidentiality, which is a little bit different, as I pointed out. But second of all, there are people who are looking for particularly you want to say a theologically weighted counseling approach versus
or maybe philosophically.
Or a philosophical approach of things that are very much within our bailiwick, what we bring to the table. that would not be appropriate for
Okay. Less medical, maybe.
I would say less secularly psychological.
Okay.
Maybe that's how I would put it. This is perhaps a more theologically psychological approach
Okay.
to
All
counseling.
right. All right. So how would you serve? Because ever since all the way going back to basic training, it was always impressed upon us that even if you don't have any sort of religious affiliation or a faith, a personal faith, that the chaplains are still of use to you, and you're free to go to them. How would you make yourself available to somebody who is say that they were an atheist or they just didn't have any sort of religious background or affiliation?
First of all, let me tell you that I would tell that I think I can honestly say probably I'm spitballing here. 35 to 40% of the people that walk into my office to talk will tell me that they're not religious at all. That could either mean that they are agnostic or atheist. It's not the point. Uh, People who are searching, people who are looking for answers, people who need hope, don't need to have a label attached to that. This is a source where they believe they can go to find those answers, even if the word God is not mentioned whatsoever. Yeah, we have the only Buddhist chaplain in the Air Force, Chaplain Campbell, who is an atheist.
Okay.
So, I had a chaplain saying, well, how could you have an atheist chaplain? My answer was, my job is to make our office as accessible to as many people as possible.
Sure. Yeah.
So, you're a Christian and have to hear a message through the lens of Jesus. Okay, well, we've got a Baptist for you. You are somebody who just wants a godly approach to something. Well, I'm here for that. You want no God at all? We've got that too.
Yeah.
I've shared with Colonel Sub that I'm aggressively pursuing, trying to bring on a reservist that I'm headhunting from somewhere else who is a female LGBTQ chaplain.
Oh, okay.
Which I think just only expands
Sure.
the ability for us to serve as many people as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, for no other reason, just to give people the option of feeling more like they can have somebody that they can relate with a similar background as them. So
Absolutely.
that's great. Yeah, that's good to know. This is a huge question, but if you could boil it down, why I've always wondered why is the Jewish community suffered so much victimization all over the world for most of recorded history?
Wow. You went right into it. That's the big one. There's only two ways I believe you could theologically justify. I like to tell people we don't have a monopoly on suffering,
Mm-hmm.
but we definitely have the longest track record. There's only two ways you can justify this theologically. One, which many religions adopt, is that we're cursed. The other is just open up the Bible. The Bible, God specifically lays out exactly how much suffering we will go through if we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. We believe that we have a very specific mission in this world to represent God to the world. The Bible describes that you will be a nation of priests, a holy nation. A nation of priests doesn't mean that we're better than anybody else. In Judaism, priests aren't better than anybody else. They just have a different role than everybody else. So we have a specific role. That's why we have the rules we have. I'm not better than you. I just have a different lifestyle than you. And the idea of that lifestyle, hopefully, is to show the grandeur of God in the world. And I think to some degree, over the last 3,500 years that we've been doing this, we've succeeded. We're the ones who taught the world that it wasn't the mightiest person, the one who can kill the most amount of people, who's the greatest, but it's the one who can think the deepest and who can be as compassionate as possible. The idea of charity, the idea of taking care of the widow and the orphan, all of this comes from our tradition that we spread. It was picked up by Christians, picked up by Muslims, but they will not in any way take away the source of them, that they are branches off of this root that begins at Sinai.
Right.
On the other hand, the vast majority of Jews don't observe this faith. So the idea that somehow this is an anomaly, well, if we believe God says, if you do what you're supposed to be doing, things will go well. If you don't, it won't. It's a reminder that we have a very specific relationship that we're held accountable to. Herman Wouk, the great author of Winds of War, The Caine Mutiny, some of the great books. So many don't know, Herman Wouk passed away recently. He was Orthodox Jew. he wrote the introduction to, uh, well, let me back up. Benjamin Netanyahu, the former prime minister of Israel's brother,
Okay.
was Jonathan Netanyahu, Yoni Netanyahu, who was the only Israeli casualty in the Entebbe raid in 1976 in Uganda. After he died, people found his papers, his diaries. It turned out that Yoni Netanyahu was a Renaissance man. He was a poet. He was an author. He was an artist. He was an incredible man. And they published his papers. And Woke wrote an introduction to it. And in that introduction, he talks about how meaningful it must be for Yoni's father to at least know why his son died. He said, Woke's son died of a disease. He goes, I'll never know why my son died. You at least know why he died. He died defending a nation, defending a land. And he makes the point that the only difference in the Holocaust between those who were in the camps was not if they were religious, not religious, if they were male or female, if they were adult or child. No. The only difference was those who knew why they were there and those who didn't know why they were there. Those who knew that this is part of our history, that we are going to go through these moments and these passages of time where we have to be reminded that we're just not like necessarily everybody else in the world. We don't embrace it. You know, there's an old joke. It's like, I'm very glad, God, that you chose us as to be your chosen people. But looking at things, you know, can you choose somebody else for once? But and that's a deep theological idea that takes a lot more fleshing out. But
Sure.
That's the broad brushstroke.
Yeah. Well, that's great, Rabbi. Is there anything that you want to leave us with?
I think that the biggest takeaway from a month like this should be the shared humanity we all have. How tragic it is that we live in such a divided time where I can sum up the entirety of a person by their political party. Yeah. If I am a proponent of party A and someone else a proponent of party B, as much as we may try to think that that encompasses everything I am and everything that person is, and if I therefore am opposed to that person politically, I must be opposed to that person about everything. The truth is, if we sat down and had a conversation, we'd realize that what divides us are so few things, and what unites us are so many things.
Right.
So the fact that we have a society that has deified politics. I mean, I'm 58 years old. I don't remember this when I was a kid. I don't remember this when I was in my 20s or 30s.
That's refreshing to hear.
I don't remember this obsession with politics as defining
like
my
rock
entire
stars,
life.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is the 24-hour news cycle where you have to keep finding things to talk about and ginning them up. And politics has become the be-all and end-all of everything because it does go on 365 days a year.
Right.
But it doesn't define who we are. It's such that, you know, I joke around. All these people were screaming and yelling when Trump became president. You know, the sun rose and the sun set and people went to work. And when Biden became president and the other half were going crazy, the sun rose and the sun set and people had to go to work. Most people's lives did not substantively change. Even though if you would have just simply listened to the rhetoric, you would think that the entire country was about to explode. Didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, and like you said, it's when you have a 24-hour news cycle, if it's a slow news day, you got to fill that 24 hours up with something. And so you're going to make everything seem as if it's equally as important as anything else that you would happen to talk about that day. So,
you know, it used to be if it bleeds, it leads.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Well, bleeding now is not about gunshots. It's about inflicting wounds through hyperbole, wounds through ad hominems, just ripping people to pieces. That's the bleeding that's going on now, and it leads.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much for that. That's really informative. I'm glad that we finally got an opportunity to get our schedules together. So.
It was my honor.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.